Hi everybody. I think we're just about ready to start. So welcome to this first panel. Sorry if I'm sounding a little hoarse, as you can hear. Just come off a number of flights actually this week, and I think the air conditioning has got the better of my voice a little bit. So I think there's an additional sponsor for my session, which is Strepsils, supporting me getting ready for this panel. But really delighted to be here at the summit. So to introduce myself, I'm Steve Wood. I'm a special advisor at the law firm Allen & Overy. I'm also the director of my own consulting company called PrivacyX Consulting, and I'm also a visiting policy fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute. My former life until last year, and the relevance for this panel was that I used to be the Deputy Information Commissioner at the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, so the data protection regulator for the UK. I worked there for about 15 years in a range of policy roles. So that's the background that I bring to the panel today. So yeah, the panel today is on generative AI, data protection and privacy. And it's a really important topic, I think, that sometimes some people could forget if they're moving very, very fast in the generative AI space. And obviously the role of the panel today, I think, is to demonstrate to you as to why data protection is a really important issue to consider in the regulation of generative AI. I think we obviously want to explore questions about what compliance means in practice, because data protection, if you haven't come across it in a great deal of detail, can be perhaps quite a daunting topic. So we're going to try and break that down into lots of practical conversations about what organizations really need to think about. And of course as well, we want to sort of drill into why data protection can actually be an enabler for responsible innovation. Data protection doesn't need to be a departmental no, but how can we actually approach data protection, really effectively mitigate the risks which will arise from the use of personal data in generative AI systems. So obviously that's what we've got at the center of our discussions today, how personal data is used in generative AI systems. And I think it's important to obviously think that we've got a complex ecosystem in terms of how personal data flows through generative AI systems, with the data that's harvested, and obviously we saw that in Sir Nigel's presentation earlier about training data, so the different sources of personal data, how the personal data is then used in the models of developers, how personal data is then used in the models of deployers, and also how personal data is used when the systems learn from queries and feed back that data in. Generative AI systems will also produce outputs as well, which will contain personal data. So the different points of consideration and inflection related to data protection are complex, and all of those different risks will need to be mitigated. So data protection will pose many different questions which are really fundamental to protection of individuals related to generative AI, and we'll obviously drill into some of those today. I won't list them all, but just to highlight certain issues like transparency, fairness, bias, risk mitigation. All of these are crucial questions relating to generative AI. And ultimately as well, how can we deliver data protection by design is an important question. We're also going to need to consider how companies can actually introduce this as part of their governance. What governance can they leverage from their existing framework? What do they need to do in terms of new areas of governance? And I think it's worth noting as well that regulators, so data protection regulators, like the ICO, where I used to work, are already active in this space. So earlier this year, we had the regulatory action by the Garante, the Italian Data Protection Authority, who ordered a temporary ban on the use of ChatGPT in Italy. And just last week, we had a preliminary enforcement action from the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK against the social media platform Snap for their use and embedding of ChatGPT in their chat functions as well. So just to illustrate that this is a live and moving space. So that's a bit of a scene setter, but now I wanted to introduce the really great panel with practical experience who are going to help unpack some of these questions for you. And they really come from a great range of different perspectives. They're all involved at the coalface of these issues, but they come from different perspectives. So we've got the perspectives of a law firm, we've got the perspectives of a consulting firm, and we've got the perspectives of a major technology company. So first of all, to my left, so moving round, we've got Karishma Brahmbhatt, who is counsel at Allen & Overy, Magic Circle law firm who operate globally. Next, we've got Camilla, who is head of privacy at Gemserv, who are actively working in providing consulting services and delivering AI solutions. And lastly, we've got Rafaela Nicolazzi, who is international privacy policy lead for Google in Europe as well. So we saw Google's name a lot on those slides earlier, so we know that Google are obviously at the heart of some of these key questions, and we obviously want to really hear the range of experience we've got from this excellent panel today, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end. So we're all set up, we've got the panel ready to go. And the first question I want to ask the panel is, they've all been dealing with these issues now for a period of time in terms of compliance with data protection laws and generative AI. So what are the key challenges and the key risks that you will see in approaching this task, just to draw out some of the key challenges to sort of kick the conversation off? And I think just to frame this as well, when we talk about data protection laws, obviously in the UK here we have the GDPR, we have the UK GDPR, in the EU we have the GDPR, and we have different data protection laws around the world. So obviously the speakers will probably be referring to GDPR, and we'll be thinking about that perhaps primarily as data protection law here. Of course, there are many different data protection laws around the world, and lots of the points we make will be relevant to those laws as well. So I'm going to turn to you, Karishma, first, and can you open up on this perspective on the key challenges and what you've been seeing working with clients?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. As Steve said, I am a lawyer at A&O. I specialize in data and technology laws with a particular focus on data protection. I think the first thing to note is that at the moment, we are operating within a framework comprised of a patchwork of laws. There is no single source of truth when it comes to regulation of AI or even regulation of data use, be that personal or non-personal. And that's a particular challenge that clients' organizations are facing, because traditionally, when you're looking at something like GDPR compliance, you've got the privacy team in-house who'd be in charge of rolling out the different components of the compliance framework, and they'd work with the risk and compliance team. Something like AI, and we'll talk about the practicals and the governance aspect shortly, but something like AI really does need that multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary input. And so I think it's useful to frame the discussion in the context of you are working with a number of different people within the organization when you're dealing with the data aspects in particular of either developing an AI system or deploying an AI system, so procuring it from a third party. It's also worth noting that the risk lies, or the data risk lies on a spectrum, and there are a number of variables that can either amplify or minimize the risk. And these include things like the nature and volume of data you're using, whether it involves any sensitive or special category data, the jurisdiction, the purposes, and the purpose will come up again and again because it's so critical to your overall risk assessment. The societal impact, whether you're fine-tuning or tailoring the system somehow, and also what the types of security measures that you've got in place to prevent things like data leakage, as Nigel Shadbolt alluded to earlier, as well as any automated decision-making that might be taking place as a result of your use of the AI system. Two scenarios will produce exactly the same risk assessment result. The chances are they'll all be tailored or they'll be nuanced somehow, but it's worth thinking about these different vectors that can affect the level of risk involved in your system. Steve's already mentioned the fact that the data protection authorities are at the forefront of leading the charge on enforcement actions in relation to the use and deployment or development and deployment of AI systems. So I'm not going to dwell on that, but again, from a practical perspective in terms of what organizations are finding challenging, When you're thinking about overall organizational risks, one of the things you take into account is the enforcement risk. And here there does seem to be some relatively significant enforcement risk, particularly, the bigger the company, the bigger the risk, because everybody knows about you. But also, as I guess the Clearview cases are showing, the more intrusive or potentially intrusive your processing activities, the more likely you are to be caught in the crosswires or crosshairs of regulatory action. Now, in terms of the common issues and areas of friction between data protection laws and data-intensive technologies like AI, it's the usual suspects. And if you're familiar with data protection laws, and Steve already said, in the UK we've got the GDPR EU, we've got GDPR elsewhere, we've got different laws, but they all talk about similar themes and similar principles. And we're seeing this in the various enforcement cases around the world. Just taking ChatGPT as an example. So Steve mentioned the guarantee action, but the guarantee is only one of a number of different data protection authorities and jurisdictions looking into generative AI. And others such as Japan, South Korea, Brazil, the US, Canada, the Ibero-US network of data protection authorities and the European Data Protection Board are all looking into this particular type of technology and the way in which it interacts with data and data protection laws. And the common issues that all of these regulators emphasize, some to a greater extent than others, include things like transparency and explainability, which I'm sure everyone here is a bit sick of hearing about transparency, explainability, fairness, bias, anti-discrimination. But those are the usual suspects. And I guess when we think about the impact of an AI system, both on the organization as well as the broader impact, those are the things that have got the most substantial effect in practice, but they're also the bits that the regulators are picking up on, because those principles already exist in data protection laws. And so in terms of giving data protection authorities a stick to beat companies with, it will be these principles. And the other ones that they've been picking up on are things like data minimization, the lawful basis for processing the data. So on what basis are you scraping data from the internet to train your AI model? On what basis are you making decisions about people or circumstances using that data? Purpose limitation comes up again and again, because often the data that's used to train the models is being used for a secondary purpose. Chances are it won't have been collected specifically for the purposes of training the AI system. And finally, the accuracy. I think it's worth shouting out to that one, because that links in with the misinformation aspects, it links in with the hallucination aspects. And I guess depending on who in the organization you talk to, whether it's the lawyers or the engineers or the compliance people, everybody will have slightly different terminology. And again, I'll mention that in a bit more detail later on, but everyone will have slightly different terminology to talk about the same types of issues. So I've got one last point I want to mention before I hand over the mic, and that's the ethical aspects that I think can pose quite a challenge internally. So a couple of years ago, I remember just before the lockdowns, I was talking to clients about data ethics and how they can embed it. And at the time, there were some who were very receptive to the concept, and others who were like, oh, it's a bit too academic, what does it really mean for me in practice? That dialogue has now switched to the concept of responsible AI, where we're talking about embedding somewhat vague or potentially vague principles into a more corporate environment. So the challenge here is translating things like human-centered values and inclusive growth and sustainable development, all concepts that organizations like the OECD have been promoting, and turning them into actionable items for the organization. Like, what does inclusive growth mean for the development team? Does that mean that you need a diversity of backgrounds, educations, etc. In terms of who makes up that the development team. Does it mean that there are specific purposes for which they're allowed to develop an AI system? And so these are the types of questions that you need to be thinking about when it does come to the ethical aspects, because I think AI in particular is one technology for which you can't escape the ethical bits. For others, ethics didn't play such a big role, but for AI, I think the role's only going to get bigger. So on that note, I will hand over the mic.
Thanks so much, Karishma. It's a really great opening. I think there's certainly a message there about sort of same old principles, but new challenging context, and how we take those well-known data protection principles, which have been around actually for over 30 years now, and actually sort of applied them in this new context. And it's also really interesting, I think, the links between data ethics and fairness, which is a long-standing data protection principle, and how we're going to need to really consider that. And it will become a legal issue, not a sort of an academic issue as well. So that's a great opening. So I'm now going to pass over to Camilla for your perspective on those challenges.
Super, thank you. So I'm going to take it from a slightly different perspective. I'm going to look at the kinds of organisations that I'm talking to and the different ways that they're tackling this. And there's 4 broad camps for me. First of all, you have organisations who don't think they're using AI yet. I would bet you anything that there's some going on somewhere. They just don't know about it. They're not sure what to do, and it scares them. They bother me because a lot of times the immediate reaction to that is to ban AI. So they just take away access to things like ChatGPT for the moment while they work out what to do. Those organisations almost certainly have people who have come up with their own use cases for things like ChatGPT and are now doing it on their own computing devices outside of all of the organisational security perimeter. With no training, because there are no policies and no rules and no training being provided. And early adopters, by nature, are quite gung-ho, I would say. And there are lots of things that those organisations might not want to be happening, like sharing sensitive corporate data in a way that may then form part of a data set and breach confidentiality, totally unknown to the organisation. And I'm on a number of sort of Facebook groups and things that are where those people are talking to each other about things and how they're using these things. And a lot of the questions that go in there are, how do I get away with this now I've been told that I can't? Right, so that's a bit worrying for those ones. They need to really mature fast. The second type of organisation that I'm seeing are the ones who make me slightly more confident, who come to us asking for help with building an AI strategy. And they're being thoughtful, they recognise that this is something that they're going to have to do, and we're in a position where we can go and put a whole plan together of how you're going to tackle AI, what order you're going to do things in. Are you going to start with, are you going to try and build something yourself? Are you going to try and buy other people's services? Are we going to start by training people and starting to draw out the use cases that people are naturally coming up with for these tools and find out what they're doing? So they make me quite happy, I like that. Then you have the third kind of organisation, which is starting to think about buying third-party software. From a cybersecurity point of view, it's one of your biggest threat vectors. Some of the ones that bother me in particular with software include, Karishma mentioned there's a patchwork of laws out there. There's not only a patchwork of laws, there are really significant philosophical differences in the ways that different countries tackle the laws that they're putting in place. So if you look at the EU, broadly speaking, it's banned unless it's allowed. If you go to the US, it's allowed unless it's banned. Those things make things completely different. And in terms of what that software is going to be built like and how it's going to land, if you come to somewhere that GDPR applies, which is a no unless it's allowed, a law, you can end up in situations like we've seen with ChatGPT being banned by Garante, or with things changing. So one of the most interesting decisions that we've had recently was around a facial recognition technology called Clearview AI, where a number of regulators in the UK and in other countries in the EU all said, we want you to extract the data of our citizens from your database. That's incredibly difficult to do. Nigel Shadbolt earlier mentioned that 50% of the data in training databases was coming from social media. Again, a whole raft of regulators have written to the social media companies and asked them to put in place safeguards to stop their data being scraped from their websites. So that sounds like the next step might be, let's take that out of the data sets as well. What's the impact of doing that when you're taking out such a large amount of data? Well, you're probably going to end up with changes to the way those systems operate that people don't necessarily see coming. And we've seen an example of that happening with a chatbot called Replica, where Replica was a chatbot that people had social, let's say parasexual relationships with sometimes. They formed very, very close emotional and romantic bonds with their chatbots. Romantic I'm using, it's doing a lot of heavy lifting here. They were having a really good time with their chatbots, these people, right? And then the Italian regulator realized that actually that service was also potentially accessible by children. And because that was one of the things that this bot did, the bot was actually introducing this kind of dimension into the relationships, and it told them they had to stop. Now, Replica claims that this isn't why they turned that feature off for all of their users, but they definitely did, to the point where we ended up with Reddit sharing information about the Samaritans to help people who've suddenly lost an incredibly important emotional relationship in their lives. It happened very quickly with no notice, and those people didn't see it coming. So it's quite possible if you're using a technology that you're buying in, that there could be something happens that changes the way that that technology works in a way that you aren't easily able to predict and adapt to. So that's a concern. And then the final one is organisations that are thinking of using their own data sets to build their own AI models, which sounds like it's safer because you've got more control over it, but the data set that you're going to use fundamentally wasn't built with the intention of becoming a machine learning data set. So when you start looking at that data set and asking questions around bias and ethics and all of those things, you're probably going to find some interesting facts out about your customers and your ability to represent the world at large, and what are you going to do with that, not just for the AI model, but for, how is that interacting with you as an organisation? So there are also issues with organisations using pots of data that have built up over time, not just with legal things like how do you repurpose the data legally, but also with things like, do you actually trust the data that you've got? And so I've worked with organisations where we've been putting together a proof of concept, and actually it's been a real struggle to get to the point where you could actually build that proof of concept out larger because of the lack of trust in the data, the amount of effort that needs to go in to get that data to a point where people actually trust they're going to get the right answers. They can expand the use cases out across the data sets. So I'm aware I may be talking to some people here who are not sort of on the buy side, which I'm talking about, but on the sell side. And so what I'd say your challenge is the board's almost certainly very, very nervous about actually doing this in practice. However keen they might be on experimenting with your system and putting the proof of concept in and what have you, actually getting that rolled out at the moment into something that's really put in practice on any kind of scale is difficult. And to my mind, one of the things that organisations really need to do is make sure that they are demonstrably engaging with privacy and cybersecurity teams, because that's where the trust in the model is going to come from. Mm-hmm. So, that needs to be really obvious and demonstrable and part of the marketing and sales and the conversation you're having. So the last thing that I'm going to say on all of this is I got an RFP, a request for proposal recently, from a large organisation where they're looking at implementing an open source AI in with their existing data sets. And they've had no conversations with cybersecurity or data protection yet. And yet they're going to market. And that tells me that it's quite possible that there are organisations out there that are going to organisations who will do this for them, who won't tell them that they need to interact with privacy and cybersecurity, won't be able to do it themselves, and they're going to end up in a pickle. So yeah, that's what I've got to say on that. There's a lot of practical challenges in organisations. I'll hand back.
Thanks very much, Camilla. Some really great points there about the...
One, two. Really sorry, everyone. The fire alarm's going off, and the reason is because the fire curtain here is being blocked, and it will keep going off. So this line here, there can be no chairs because it's the fire blank, it's a fire curtain, and that's why the fire alarms are going off. So if we could make sure that this area here is completely free. That's why you keep hearing the fire alarm, and they're all outside. Yeah. Sorry? Yes, okay. Okay. 1, 2.
Thanks very much. Anyway, that's cleared up because poor old Camilla had to. She talked very eloquently through the fire alarm there. But, okay. Make sure that's not going to create any feedback as well. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hopefully that's a bit clearer, and you can hear my slightly hoarse voice a bit clearer. No, thanks very much, Camilla. Your intervention was really great there, I think, in actually illustrating the stage of the different levels of maturity that organisations are in their implementations, and also the different sort of use cases in terms of whether they're doing things in-house or buying things in, and the different data protection risks for the merge. And I think also, your last example as well about the risk in organisations who are moving very quickly of not involving their data protection officers or their privacy teams. And I think the risks that creates in terms of the audit trail, in terms of potential future regulatory action, I think is really important. So making sure data protection is an early consideration is obviously essential. And a really good point as well about the impacts on children as well. That's a key feature of the regulatory action here in the UK that I mentioned earlier in terms of that example from Snap as well. So over to you, Rafaela, to talk about your experience at Google on these challenges. I'm going to pass the mic down.
Shall we try maybe here first, and then you tell me if should I really go? Okay, so thanks so much, and I'm happy to see that the privacy panel managed to retain half of the conference guests over a market panel, so I think that's a good sign of how important privacy is for the privacy debate, right? And let me start picking on something that Sir Nigel mentioned, and of course bringing the flavors, the colors from Google, which is, again, AI is not new to anyone, and this is of course so very true for Google. AI has been in our products since the very early beginning, so think about search that has AI, and search has improved over the years because of AI that's applied into it. Think about Google Maps that give us traffic or delays, and that's because of the powers of AI embedded into this product. And even Google Gmail that helps block spam messages, 10 million messages per minute because of AI technologies. But I think the way that I see is that over the past months, we are in fact having more awareness of this tool, not as a back tool, but more as a front-centered tool, especially with the chatbots that we heard many times here, and we're calling it as generative AI. So just to bring this into context, which I think it's quite important. And because we're seeing this tremendous potential that Gen AI can bring to business, to governments, to society, for us, there's a need to consider to promote progress with responsibility, time, and meaningful conversations with all sectors involved that will be impacted, are going to be impacted, and in events like we're having here today. And with that in mind, for Google, we've decided, I think we heard that word many times here, responsible AI, and we came with what we call bold, responsible, and together approach on developing AI, where bold means being responsible from the start, and together means that it must be a collective effort, that we need to work with researchers, with social science, with lawyers, with governments, creators, publishers, and etc. And as Steve mentioned, I work in the public policy team, so I wanted to add to my guests here today with my colleagues and share a bit of what I see as what are the policy challenges we're going to be facing ahead of us. And we definitely need to think about one consideration that I heard. Right now, we were in an event with all the DPAs from all over the world, and the UK ICO Commissioner, John Edwards, he mentioned something that I think was quite provocative. He said that he doesn't see that when it comes to AI and privacy, there is a lock in the law. He says quite eloquently that privacy laws already apply into AI applications. GDPR, for example, is a technological neutral law. It's a principle-based law. But definitely, and then that's why I bring from a perspective, is that we're going to need, as organizations, is more certainty and clarity from those regulators, right? And then for me, this should be translated into standards on issues like we just heard, transparency, what does it mean on AI, and controls. And no more than ever, I think we have to work together with regulators, right? This is evolving and advancing at such a fast pace that if you don't have conversations, technical conversations about this technology is with lawyers, with regulators, we might be missing opportunities. And my team right now, we are working on a set of policy recommendations that will hope to be helpful for policymakers, for regulators, for the privacy community in general, as a catalyst of those challenges that would like to see coming answers as we see this as a journey. And I mean, as a researcher as well, I have to say that I haven't been more excited because we are in a point that we have more questions than answers right now. So first is definitely, I think I heard it right from my colleagues, is dialogue, right? So how do we promote these multi-stakeholder conversations towards this flexible, consistent, and regulatory guidance? And this, I mean, not only from the outside, so companies, organizations talking to the regulators, but also in the inside. So I think we speak more later about AI governance, what it means, but how engineers discuss this with the lawyers, with the public policy team, with the product teams. So there is a governance, a circle of information flowing that is leading to the direction that we want to see those products built in. The second is interoperability. So how do we strive for maximum interoperability and cohesion across regions and topics? And this, I think, is quite important from a policy perspective because as AI develops, we need to make sure these regulators are bringing different perspectives in this multinational forum, right? So they're sharing their best practices and they're promoting this interoperability when possible. So I heard already OECD here, who's drafting our work on AI. We have G7 doing work on AI as well. Once again, the GPA, which is the global conference of all DPAs, they usually come with resolutions after their conferences, which we're very likely is going to be about the topic. So how do we bring these conversations up so we all are thinking about the same issues? And second, which for me is quite key for us, is that we need to consider regulatory dialogue across domains, right? I mean, I'm suspicious, of course, I'm a privacy expert, as many of you here in the room, but AI is not just about privacy. AI is about dissemination of disinformation, it's about content, it's about security, it's about safety. So it's just one aspect of the SPRIMS. And if you don't have regulators who already covered those areas, again, talking to each other, we might have a risk of having a one-siloed approach to this very fascinating technology that we have nowadays. And I think in the UK here, there's a great example of that, which is the DRCF, the UK Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which aims to bring in different regulators into the same room to have conversations about similar issues. The third one that I want to mention is sandboxes. So how do we consider regulatory sandboxes into this discussion on AI and privacy, right? So how do we bring organizations and regulators to test safely, in a safely way, new innovative products into this with a tailored legal support? OECD, in a recent report, they flagged that there are more than 100 sandboxes around the world, which of them, some of them are already on AI. And the last point I wanted to make, that I think it's a challenge that we need to think collectively on development of this technology, is how to invest in research, in the research community that's going to be thinking about how to innovate the technology and advance privacy in the context of the AI. And this is not just for companies, right? This is to inform everybody. This is to inform the regulators. Just another example, the CNIL, the French regulator, they now have a new department just looking into AI that has been recently established. So they're starting to look into it. So we're all trying to better understand what that is. And this research that can be produced, that can be done, will definitely educate and inform us. How do we think about privacy-enhancing technologies, right? PETs, or PPT, as we also hear, which includes synthetic data, machine learning, differential privacy, and much more. So I think I'll stop here to make sure that we are on time.
Thanks so much, Rafaela. Really good context there that you provided. I think particularly talking about the challenge of getting the dialogue right on some of these issues. And I think as well, you've made some really important points about how we situate data protection and privacy against the other regulatory issues, because clearly we're all data protection experts and enthusiasts here, but it's recognizing where they sit and how it relates to other areas of regulation, I think is going to be really important for future governance as well. And I think it's really important as well to think about the global context here. So Rafaela mentioned about, you know, a number of the international standards, such as the OECD principles, and how data protection will relate to those as well. I think, you know, it's important to see the links to understand how the principles will read across as well. So some great points there for our opening round of questions. I'm now going to move swiftly into the second round. So now I want the panelists to drill in a bit deeper to talk about governance. So we've started to hint at some of these issues when we've been talking through some of the risks and challenges, but how can we better understand what organizations actually need to do in practice? So organizations are thinking about AI governance. Organizations may have data protection governance, or they probably should have data protection governance in place already. So what do they actually need to build out to actually tackle some of these issues in practice? So if we could just have sort of a few sort of practical examples from each of the panelists about how to tackle this question of governance, and again, what they're seeing from their work at the moment. So over to you, Karishma, to talk a little bit about governance.
Thanks. So I've already mentioned a couple of governance-related points. I guess if I was starting from the beginning, I'd say first thing you need to do is make sure everyone's speaking the same language, which I think a couple of us have mentioned. But even within the same organization, it can be one department to another, it can be one jurisdiction to another. Just make sure everyone is talking about the same thing when they talk about transparency or fairness or bias, so that you have got a common starting point. Once you've established that, I would say that there are three important lenses that are useful for thinking about that are useful for looking at your governance regime. So firstly, there's your governance framework as a whole. Secondly, there's the systems aspect. And then thirdly, you've got your supply chain management. And these all mean slightly different things to you, whether you're on sell side or you're buy side. But essentially what they mean is, in relation to your governance framework, to what extent can you leverage your existing policies, your existing processes, your existing reporting chain to account for your AI compliance, bearing in mind the multi-stakeholder approach that you're going to have to take for this. What are the principles? And we've mentioned ethics a couple of times, but I think it's worth mentioning again. So what are the ethical principles that you are applying to your development and use of AI systems? How do they interact with your company policy or your company principles, you know, what your organization stands for? Because the chances are the specific AI ethics principles will probably already sit underneath your mission statement as an organization. So it's a case of drawing out the bits that are specifically relevant to the use of AI and operationalizing it. And what that means in practice is coming up with specific guidance for your developers on how they can ensure fairness, as well as coming up with specific guidance for, say, your customer services team as to how they can ensure fairness, or your product teams as to how they can ensure fairness. So again, same definition for everyone, but different operationalization for everyone. The second lens I mentioned was the systems, and this is all about how the AI model is developed. And this is more one for the engineers, or for, if you're not developing internally, then for your due diligence of your third party, and kind of links into the supply chain bit. So, for example, what kinds of technological measures can you implement to mitigate the risks of your use of AI systems? You know, if you're using the system for, say, a knowledge-heavy task, then could you be using retrieval augmented generation capabilities that can help with your hallucination issues or your misinformation issues? How viable is that as a solution, and what kinds of security measures would you need to put in place? And those are, I guess, the more technical or technological measures, but there are some simpler ones as well, right? Things like access controls. Who should have access to all of the data that you're collecting or generating as part of your AI system? Who should have access to use the system itself? Camilla had alluded to minimization, data minimization potentially affecting the output. So if you minimize your data, if loads of people exercise their subject access rights and their individual rights under data protection laws, and they require you to stop processing their data, does that mean that your model would not be as representative as it might otherwise have been, because there's a whole demographic whose data has not been included in the training data set? And I think that touches on a really important point of some of these principles can be mutually exclusive. And so you might find yourself in a situation where there are trade-offs between various principles, and you have to make a decision as to what's more important in that circumstance. You know, does data minimization affect the representativeness or the fitness for purpose or the accuracy of the model you're creating? And what's the risk-based decision that you want to take there? And then finally, in relation to your supply chain management, you've got the due diligence aspect that I mentioned, and I think that's becoming even more important as the regulators and new legislation like the EU AI Act are focusing increasingly on obligations as a user of an AI model versus obligations as a developer of an AI model. And as a user, it's not good enough to say, oh, well, you know, I just procured the system from this third party. They're the developer. They're the ones who are in charge of the data sets and the compliance aspects. You need to have kicked the tires and made sure that you've asked the right types of questions so that you've got your audit trail, so that if you ever find yourself having to justify your use of the system or the decisions that you make on the basis of the system, then you've got your impact assessments, you've got your internal risk matrices to show that you've made an informed decision, you've gone into it with your eyes open, and that you can stand behind the position that you've ultimately taken. And these will inevitably flow down into your contracts with your suppliers and or your customers. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there.
Super, thank you. So I thought I might talk about what governance often looks like in an organisation, and some of the challenges that organisations are going to have from that point of view. So Karishma's done a great job of talking about how organisations, or what kind of policies organisations might want to set. That requires a senior leadership type of conversation. And the problem that you're going to have is this is really new stuff. And your senior leadership have got so many other things on their mind at the moment. We are looking at an economic difficult time, let's say. That's going to be front of mind at the moment. So you're expecting your leadership to get up to speed quickly with enough to be able to suddenly think about their corporate values in terms of data ethics, in terms of value-centered development, to understand the kinds of risks and challenges that are associated with the new technology that is being pushed hard at them by their shareholders, almost certainly. It's really tough. So I would start with, what help does your leadership need in order to be able to engage effectively with the kinds of conversations and issues that Karishma's just been talking about? And for me, that also comes into not just what language are we using, but what are we talking about? So another challenge with this being super new is that the chance of you finding an expert to help you pretty slim. There's not actually many experts out there. Like narrow expertise at the moment, but broad is harder to find. So there are, to my knowledge, 2 AI assurance qualifications, one of which came out literally a few weeks ago. I don't even know if there's been any exam scheduled yet, right? Finding somebody, therefore, who's qualified in AI assurance is going to be a challenge. Those qualifications don't look like each other. One of them is much more technical, one of them is much more around sort of regulatory, legal, ethics kind of privacy side of it. Similarly, you're looking at needing developers building these AI platforms to understand what they're doing from a governance point of view. As far as I'm aware, that qualification's been out for about a year, maybe not quite a year, and a lot of the people who've got it probably got it grandfathered because they've been doing that sort of job for a while. So when you're thinking about actually the people that you're going to put onto this problem, do they actually know what sort of models there are for how to have these conversations? Do they understand what's out there in terms of actually having a properly rounded and developed conversation? Or have they read a couple of books and some articles maybe and got a general interest, and now they're trying to apply common sense? That's a really normal way to do governance in an organization. The number of organizations I've been in where no managers have had any formal management training, they're not been taught to supervise, and yet AI really needs supervision. Where the risk committee, by and large, has learned how to do risk by being on the risk committee, and again, has had no formal training. Actually understanding what conversations to have and how to talk about it and how to not miss important things, that's really difficult. And people are doing this sort of, in addition to many other responsibilities that they've got. So when you're thinking about how to put governance in place in an organization, thinking about those real practical challenges that individuals have got and how you're going to address those is a really important part of it to me. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a whole load of unknown unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld called it. And those are where you get into real pickles. And on that note, finishing with pickles again, I'm going to hand back.
So let me comment on talking about a bit of the Google journey on AI governance. And you may know this already, but Google was the first company back in 2018 to publish our AI principles, which are a set of principles divided in 2 sections. The first one are 7 clear commitments of how we're going to be building AI into our products, and 4 applications that we'll never pursue AI for. And for this panel, I wanted to highlight the principle number 5, which is incorporate privacy design principles, which refers to the opportunity to give for users on notice and informed choices. It talks about encouraging architectures with privacy safeguards and provide appropriate transparency and control over the use of data. But I think, as already mentioned here, our CEO also said the same, that principles that remain paper are meaningless. And let me bring you the example of Bard, which is our ChatGPT, our chat model, right? Close to our, we have OpenAI. And for Bard, we came up with how to bring those concepts into the product embedded. So first is how we would strive for the highest standards on transparency. And for Bard, you're going to see a Bard Privacy Hub, for example, which is a central repository of all the information for the users on how that is being processed, including, for example, legal bases that are being used and what other controls are available to them. The second one on transparency is how do we produce clear disclosures? So disclosures on how the data is being used, informing users of the various privacy controls available to them, and disclosures about retention period. Second one is easy to use controls, right? So how do we would create for controls that users will be able to exercise their rights? The third, that also speaks a lot about this, is users at the center. So one of those other AI principles is be accountable to people. I want to ensure that designing these AI systems also provide the opportunity for feedback and also for criticism. We know this is quite important to the development of particular BARD as an experiment. So for BARD, there's also a possibility to double check. I don't know if you've seen this feature, that users can, it's a Google button that allowed users to go to Google search to check the accuracy of the response they are getting from the chatbot. And fourth, which for me really speaks to my heart, it is investing in AI literacy, right? So how do we help people better understand how to use this technology, right? So for example, I've seen many people telling me, and I always do this question, how do you use BARD? Tell me, I'm a curious person, so you tell me. And I've noticed how many people try to use it as a Google search, and it should not be, right? You should go to BARD to be your creative, helpful collaborator. It shouldn't be for you to fact check on information. For this, you have other tools. And this, for me, is key for us to get this right. And we are here in DPAs, quite concerned about that too. They want us, as organizations, to create those materials that's available to people that consume in different ways. So having a video, having leaflets like the one that I have in front of me here, having explainers that let people know what this technology is, what are controls that they care about, that they want to use, and how to really take the best out of that tool. So I think I'll stop here, Steve.
I'm terribly sorry to have to ruin everyone's mood on interrupting this panel. Unfortunately, we will have to wrap up here, but I'm sure all the panelists are more than happy to stay behind to answer any questions that you may have. Apologies, it's just because the other panel has wrapped up, and we now need to move on to the next segment, which is a networking break, so it's going to get a little bit rowdy, so you won't be able to hear anything otherwise. So apologies again, but thank you to the panel here today.